Hi guys, welcome to Lines in Between podcast. I'm Catherine, and today I'm gonna be answering some of the questions you sent via my Instagram and Facebook. If you're new here, we have actually uploaded 3 episodes prior to this one, so you can check that out on YouTube or listen on Spotify. So let's dive into the questions that you sent. The first question is, what was your biggest obstacle with regards to deciding to launch this podcast? To be honest, the biggest obstacle I faced personally is deciding to put myself out there. At first, I got scared to put myself in a situation where I would be vulnerable in front of people who will watch the video or listen to the podcast episode. I didn't want attention. I didn't want people commenting about my life or the way that I live my life. I personally am not the type of person to share a lot. Honestly, before starting Lines in Between podcast, I had no posts on Instagram. I rarely share stories. The same goes with Facebook. I'm really a private person. Even if our family loves to travel and I've been to a lot of good places, I don't really share much about it because I am the type of person who loves quiet. I am actually an introvert, and I didn't think that I'd ever be called to put myself out there so that I can share my personal journey through my faith and my mental health. So I'd say that that's the biggest obstacle. Next question. How do you think churches and church groups can improve in being a safe space for people with mental health struggles? I think this question could come from a person who's struggling, who currently doesn't feel safe in a church environment, and it could also come from a person wanting to create a safe space for people who struggle. So if you're a person struggling with mental health and you don't feel safe, I empathize with you, and I can't imagine how hard it is for you to struggle and not be able to say it, not be able to have a safe environment to be vulnerable. And if you're someone wanting to create that safe space for people around you who struggle, we actually share the same passion. That is one of the reasons why I started the podcast. Because I was in spaces that aren't safe enough to say that it hurts so much. There were people in my life before who would dismiss what I was going through and would want to solve it by telling me, just be faithful in prayer, just do your quiet time, keep going to church. But at that time, I was hurting. And that is the reason why I am passionate about faith and mental health. So if you're asking, how can the church improve in creating a safe space? I'd say that we have to allow people to struggle and create a safe space for them where there is no judgment, where we would not label them as someone who lacks faith in God. I've shared this in the past podcast episode wherein I talked about making space for yourself to struggle, and in that you'll have compassion and you'll be able to make space for others to suffer too. Suffering is real in our life and in the lives of the people around us, in the church and outside. We see that if we don't allow ourselves to feel emotions, to struggle, we can't hold that space for other people. I believe church and church groups could improve by acknowledging that mental health is real. God designed us to have emotions. God designed us to have a mind. Our brain is an organ that functions as a part of our entire body. And mental health struggles, mental health illnesses are a result of something in our brain not working properly or not producing enough hormones, or our amygdala being a certain shape instead of what it originally should be, or our prefrontal cortex not being able to filter out our response. That's why we respond emotionally. These are real. We say that we feel emotions from the heart, but it is our brain who processes how we feel. It starts with our brain. When we feel anxious, it starts with what we think. And our body, our brain rather, sends signals to our body that there is impending danger or impending doom. And that's why our body responds either by shaking, feeling your chest is tight, or you're uneasy, you can't breathe properly, you have difficulty breathing. Our mind is a part of us. I believe awareness can do wonders for us because that's where it starts. I was talking with the psych major recently, a friend of ours, and she said these words: God created the field of psychology. And many people dismiss that. But it is part of what God created. It's actually hard to talk about church and church groups because I don't want this podcast to be about attacking certain churches or church groups. All I want is to have a conversation that suffering is real, and that even as Christians, even as people who have faith in God, there's no way we can avoid suffering. We are in a broken world. It saddens me that there are spaces that aren't safe. So my short answer is awareness. We must be aware and we must accept that mental health struggles can exist even as believers in Jesus. Next question: words of advice that people should stop telling someone. Maybe instead of answering this question, I'd try to reframe it in a way that, how should you respond when someone opens up to you? I believe that it could be helpful if you ask that person, do you need solutions or do you want me to listen? That way, we won't give unsolicited advice, and at the same time, we can be present for the person if he or she is struggling. Next question: does taking action mean that we are not fully surrendered? If you are someone who's praying to the Lord about something to happen, or there is something that you already surrendered to the Lord and you feel like nothing's happening, or if you're someone who wants to surrender something to the Lord and at the same time take action, I believe that God partners with us. In the first podcast episode entitled Prayer Isn't Enough, Jet and I actually talked about how when we pray to God for healing and then we don't do something, we miss out on partnering with God. Jet and I actually talked about this in the first podcast episode. I mentioned that I believe that prayer isn't enough because we have a part to play. Prayer isn't enough because God gave us mind, will, and emotions to decide and to take responsibility for our decisions. So if your question is, does taking action mean you're not fully surrendered? I'd like to ask you a question. Is this action in obedience to God? Or is this action taking matters into your own hands Because if it is, then maybe you haven't really fully surrendered. If this action is in obedience to God as you surrender to Him, then I believe what you're doing is appropriate because you're partnering with God. I remember characters in the Bible who showed this. Gideon, for that matter, when he defeated a huge number of army with just a few of the army God allowed to be with him, I remember how God gave them the victory. And Gideon had to play his part. He had to obey every step that God asked him to do. And taking those steps didn't mean that he was not fully surrendered. It means that in surrendering to God, he obeyed. Sometimes obedience calls us to take action. And when that action is done, then we can be still. The last question is it okay to have mental health consultation even if you have faith in God's power? I initially answered this on an IG story, which I'll read. I said, someone asked what's my perspective on seeking professional help while having faith in God's power. My short answer is, consulting a psychiatrist and or going to therapy doesn't negate nor minimize your faith in God. I believe it strengthens it. If this is a question in your mind, I want to tell you that there's no shame in getting help. As long as you do the hard work of learning and relearning, I believe healing is on its way. I can't tell you how many times through therapy I have experienced the grace of God. My heart is genuinely filled with love for someone who needs to hear this. I actually empathize to the person who asked this question because maybe he is or she is someone going through mental health struggles and having hesitations to get help. So if you're that someone, I want to tell you that therapy has helped me pray again, commune with God again. I have experienced the goodness and the kindness of God through therapy. And that is something that I want many more people to experience. If you're someone who is hesitating to get help, I'll tell you the same thing. There's no shame in getting help. I believe that God can use psychiatrists, therapists to bring healing in our lives. That may take months, years, or lifetime. I believe healing is on the other side of you taking that step to get help. Getting help for your mental health struggles does not mean you have weak faith. Does not mean that you don't trust God for healing. As long as you seek the help of the right people, I really believe that as you partner with these people, your healing will come. Therapy, seeking consultation, and your faith in God are part of a collaborative work so that you may heal. I'd say it again and again. Seeking the help of a counselor, a psychiatrist, doesn't negate your faith in God's power. God is powerful, and He can use those people to bring healing to you. The question is, are you willing to do that work so that you may learn, unlearn, or relearn stuff that have been in your life for long? The question is, are you up for the battle? Thank you so much for watching or listening to this podcast episode. If you have questions that you want to be answered in the next Q&A podcast episode, you may comment it down below here on YouTube or on Spotify. Also, if you have suggestions for what we should call this Q&A segment of the podcast, please comment it down below. And thank you so much for taking the time to listen or to watch. I hope that through this podcast will make you feel seen, known, and loved. I say we because Jet helps me so much with all of this. So, yeah. Bye! I forgot. We're actually in a new setup because Banbeo Cafe and Bistro is kind enough to let me film here. So thank you so much. I hope you visit them here. See you in my next one. Bye! No, I don't want to say that.